Hi Lily, it's Grammy here with a birthday video made especially for you. It's a special day in a couple of different ways because your great-great-grandmother, as you know, was born on the same day as you, today, November 28th. That would be 134 years apart. I know that if Granny Prey was here today, she would be so incredibly proud of you. You have grown into such a beautiful, accomplished, smart, attractive, beautiful, beautiful young lady. And I only wish that she could be here to see her great-great-granddaughter and what a very special person she is and has been almost from the time that Granny first laid her eyes on my one and only Lily. So for your birthday, I thought I'd make a video for you outlining, well, maybe outlining's the wrong word, but giving you some history about your grandmother that I thought you might enjoy. I enjoyed writing about her because I loved my grandmother. I loved her so much. She was such an incredible woman. And you're growing up to be an incredible woman as well. So let me start by saying November 28th is a very special day in our family. Both my remarkable maternal grandmother and my precious granddaughter Lily were born on this day 134 years apart. Granny Prey was one of a kind, if there ever was one. And of course, our amazing granddaughter, you, Lily, are turning out to be such a bright and beautiful young lady, and we're so proud of you. My grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, were remarkable people. In the late 1800s, can you imagine this? They left the comfort of their home in Maine and traveled halfway around the world to Vladivostok, Siberia, where my grandfather and his brother set up an export business. Your great-great-grandparents were the first Americans to set up a business in Vladivostok, Siberia. The first Americans, I should say, to set up a business. From 1894 to 1930, your great-great-grandmother, a native of South Berwick, Maine, lived in Vladivostok. My granny was a prolific letter writer. Letters were sent home to her loved ones almost every day. I wonder how long it took to get from Vladivostok, Siberia to Maine in those days. That would be an interesting question to have answered. Granny's letters are the late 18th century equivalent of an internet blog dedicated to Vladivostok. By reading her correspondence, her descendants learned about the life of an ordinary human being and the history of the country where she resided. The perspective of an American getting closer and closer to her new and very foreign homeland. In 2008, a book was published about her life, which became a bestseller, titled Russia's Far East. Granny Prey became famous for the photographs she took in Vladivostok. Cameras were brand new in those days. I mean, hardly anybody that didn't have a little bit of wealth could even afford one. But Granny Prey was a very enthusiastic photographer. Thanks to her prolific picture taking, she recorded scenes that no one else ever recorded in Vladivostok. And along with the prolific letters she wrote, those days, of which there is very little history written, were recorded for posterity's sake. And they are an amazing history of that part of Russia. Granny Prey to me was an extraordinary woman, a stalwart in every sense of the word, and I loved her so dearly. At the young age of 14, I lost her. Nonetheless, I remember so many special moments we shared. She actually was responsible for teaching me how to sew and do some of the creative arts that have brought me so much enjoyment in my life. And you, Lily, have been the recipient of some of those creative gifts, that creative spirit I got from your great-great-grandmother. Oh my goodness, what a story. The part that Granny Pray that I just love is the fact that she was 6,000 miles away from her home in Maine, and living a life that she never could possibly have imagined. The thousands of letters over 36 years were sent home to Berwick, painting a picture of a former farm girl from a small town in Maine navigating her new bourgeois lifestyle from Tsar Alexander III to the early years of Stalin's rule. Granny provided an astounding record of life in Vladivostok at a time in history that was a very important time in history, a very colorful, a very sad in some ways time in history, all of which now are housed in the Library of Congress for all the world to see. The people of Vladivostok have honored your great-great-grandmother by erecting a bronze statue where she is clutching a letter close to her chest, one of the thousands that she wrote home over 3 decades. The existence of Eleanor Pray, let alone her legacy of words and images, is not widely known in her hometown of Berwick, but in Vladivostok she was celebrated for providing an opportunity for the city to rediscover a piece of its history that had been lost to the war and the Russian Revolution. The Arseniev, Arseniev, Arseniev State Museum in Vladivostok a decade ago opened an exhibit about your great-great-grandmother that remains popular with visitors to this day, and curators now hope to open a large exhibit in the home where your great-great-parents lived. They had a beautiful house overlooking the bay at Vladivostok. Roxana Eleanor Lord was born in 1868, and as we know, she grew up in Berwick, Maine, in a house that was named Elm Wold, a tidy Cape Cod-style house just up the hill from the river, separating a small farm community from Somersworth, New Hampshire. And by the way, Somersworth, New Hampshire was where she met your great-great-grandfather. As a young woman, Granny worked for 7 years at a mill in Somersworth, crossing the river each day on a footbridge near her home. She was nicknamed Aunt Roxy by family members and friends. When she was 26 years old, she married Frederick, Ted, Pray, and moved with him to Russia to work in the American store owned by his sister and brother-in-law, Charles and Sarah Smith. Now, isn't that something, Lily? She went from being Eleanor Lord to Roxanne Eleanor Pray. So her name ended up being Roxana Lord Pray. In the spring of 1894, the Smiths and Pray went to East Siberia together, traveling first by train across the United States to San Francisco. Then they took a schooner to Japan and on to Vladivostok. When Granny moved there, Vladivostok was still a remote outpost, some 7,000 miles east of Moscow and 16 hours ahead of the time zone in New York City. From the first day of her journey to her destination so far from home, Granny wrote long letters to her family and friends in New England, some 40 and 50 pages long. Can you imagine that? Wow, that is remarkable. She described in detail the meals she ate, the visits she had with friends who had moved from all over the world to live in Vladivostok, and in time the political turmoil she wrote about, which drastically altered altered the city she grew to love, and actually it gosh, I'm getting tongue-tied. It also altered her life. She lived through historic events. She learned several languages while she lived in Vladivostok. She read voluminously and led a vibrant cosmopolitan life, very different from that of her provincial origins. She met generals, admirals, royalty, and political leaders, and she danced to her heart's content aboard the warships in the harbor. Well, Vladivostok was the only harbor that stayed open all winter that didn't freeze over, so I guess there were a lot of merchant ships that came in there. She also saw the vast destruction of people and property during the political turmoil she lived through, and those people lost everything that she held dear in Vladivostok. And so did she when she finally had to leave, but she never lost her memories and her pride. I remember Granny telling me a number of stories about standing up to Russian Bolshevik leaders. I can see her now. She had no fear. She had a command presence like no other, and she would not take any guff from any of them. If she didn't like what they were telling her to do, she'd tell them to get lost, or perhaps in more strong or more direct terms. My grandmother's early letters home to Maine described navigating a life in a new country. She wrote of the beauty of the hills rising around Vladivostok, the way a ship waltzed across the nearly frozen Golden Horn Bay that lay beneath their home, and the simple joy of collecting mushrooms in an open field. Oh, there's something so poetic and beautiful about what she wrote there. Granny wrote in her letters, beyond Paris, Vladivostok is probably the most fascinating city on earth at the moment. We are so lucky to witness so many interesting things happening around us here and now in Vladivostok. But in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War was in full swing, and Granny's letters began to include description of how life in Vladivostok was now beginning to change. By the start of World War I, Granny stood on a train platform to wave goodbye to German friends headed into exile during the political upheaval that began in 1940 and continued into the 1920s. Many foreigners living in Vladivostok left the city to return to their homes wherever they lived in America or abroad. Those who stayed, including my granny and her sister and brother-in-law, they were pretty much uprooted from the lifestyle they had enjoyed, but they loved Vladivostok and decided not to leave. Your great-great-grandfather, Frederick Prey, went to work for the U.S. consulate in Vladivostok, and in 1918 they closed the American store. That was a year after the Russian Revolution began. Soon thereafter, Granny Prey began working as a volunteer and treasurer with Vladivostok chapter of the American Red Cross. After the death of her beloved husband in 1923, my dear sweet grandmother was totally devastated. With insufficient funds, she took tenants into her home, cooked frugal meals, and went to work as a bookkeeper to support herself. When the firm she worked for closed in 1930, your great-great-grandmother had no choice but to leave Vladivostok for Shanghai, China, where by that time her daughter, my mother, was married to a prominent American doctor who set up his practice in Shanghai. In one of her last letters from Vladivostok, Granny wrote about her farewell dinner, describing the bowls of snapdragons and the white dahlias on the table, the cold salmon served for dinner, and the lump in her throat at the idea of leaving it all behind. Granny wrote aboard the SS Glennifer as she left Vladivostok, "Here I am sailing on and on, every turn of the screw taking me farther from the home I dearly loved for 36 years. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine how horrible that was for her. She was on her way to Shanghai, where she stayed for many, many years until the war broke out and we were in prison and concentration camp, as you well know, Lily. She became a house mother at the Shanghai American School, the alma mater of my mother. Subsequently, she moved in with my parents, who had a beautiful home located in the international settlement of Shanghai. After the egregious attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II, Granny was interned with the rest of our family, as you know, in a Japanese prison camp. We were fortunate to be liberated in 1943 and returned to the United States in an exchange of Japanese prisoners for American prisoners. Weren't we fortunate? We were able to leave before the war ended. We returned to the United States on an exchange ship known as the SS Gripsholm, a Swedish mail ship that brought us home across the equator 4 times, finally landing in New York City 2 months later. How I enjoyed hearing stories about my granny's lack of adhering to rules she thought were unreasonable. One example, Granny orders were to take no documents. These were orders by the Japanese upon leaving a concentration camp. She was ordered not to take any documents, but she smuggled a cache of letters in her corset. Being a portly woman, she also stashed my mother's silver around her waist. I just love this part. She stuffed other items into suitcases of her 3-year-old twins. That would be your Grammy. So Grammy was never touched by a Japanese guard because Granny Prey would look at him like she smelt something that stunk to heaven, and they didn't dare touch her. Well, it was fortunate because the Japanese had a respect for the elderly, and Granny Prey was a awesome, empowered figure, I can tell you that. Well, Granny Prey got away with a lot of mischief when she was up against guards in concentration camp, too. She had absolutely no fear. My mother was horrified and scared that something would happen to her while in prison camp. But nothing ever did. She personified the meaning of a beautiful, wonderful, special, intrepid woman. In recent years, the Russian Museum curators spent more than a week in Berwick, Maine, to learn more about her roots there in the late 1800s. They listened to the praise that your great-great-grandmother sung. They saw places that she had described in her letters and studied Victorian traditions and American culture. They visited the house near the Salmon Falls River where Granny spent her early years and met with the locals who were now discovering a piece of their own history through visits with these Russians and, of course, the 3,200 letters your great-great-grandmother wrote home. In Vladivostok, the Ersenev, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, State Museum exhibit about Granny has continued to be popular with visitors who also use her books and photos to explore the city of Vladivostok. The house where Granny Prey lived is now an apartment building, but the museum wants to transform it into an exhibit that showcases her life in the port city in the early 1900s. So much curiosity about how an American could be uprooted and thrive so many thousands of miles away from home. how sad I was the day my mother called to announce the very, very tragic news that my beloved grandmother had died. She woke up one morning in 1954 in my mother's home in Washington, D.C., which is not far from where you are at Georgetown University, Lily. She went down the stairs to the kitchen, which was on the bottom floor in that Georgetown home, fixed herself a cup of hot tea, sat down, and moments later she slumped over and was dead on my parents' dining room table at age 85. Her body was returned to New Hampshire to be buried alongside her husband and her brother and sister-in-law in Somersworth, New Hampshire. So there you have it, my dear sweet Lily, the story of your courageous, brave, and amazing grandmother. And as her proud granddaughter, my planned trip with Grandpa in a year's time to visit where she lived and all those years ago will be an extraordinary experience. Cannot imagine what emotions will be running through my very heart and soul as I wrap my arms around that amazingly beautiful statue of my grandmother and your great-great-grandmother in that square in downtown Vladivostok, clutching a letter she's about to send back to her relatives and friends in Maine. Your incredible great-great-grandmother lived through historic times and provided you, my dear sweet birthday girl today, Lily, and heritage revered and cherished by all of us who are descendants of Eleanor Roxana Lord Prey. So happy birthday today, Lily. You mean so much to me and Grandpa. You are going to be growing up in the footsteps of your grandmother to be an absolutely awesome adult. And we can't wait to watch you every step of the way. So have a wonderful 19th birthday, and we send you love and kisses and more love and kisses. We love you, Lily. You are our very, very special granddaughter. Happy birthday!